Today I want to discuss why free people will always flee the left's utopia, and why the left can't really allow this to happen. And I'm going to kind of put today's freedom flights that we see out of leftist cities like Portland, Seattle, New York, and San Francisco, and kind of put this in the historical context of what we have witnessed for over a century throughout the world. Now, before I do, I hope to encourage you not to flee this video today. And in fact, if you take a few seconds to like, subscribe, and then share this video with others, even those you disagree with, it costs you nothing and it helps us expand our video reach every time that you engage with us. So now back to why free people always flee the left's utopia. And listen, this may not be a politically correct topic, but it is an observation that just can't be denied by anybody who's observing the world around them. Once the left collective kind of gets fully entrenched in a city or a nation, they seem incapable of doing anything else but push their utopian dreams onto their neighbors. And we've really never seen the collectivist left behave in a kind of a live and let live attitude. It's always about just imposing their will on others, whether their neighbors want the promised utopia or not. So for those kind of new to history, or if you've been abused by the public school Common Court Out history program, this might come as a surprise to you. But go visit almost any major downtown urban environment in our nation, and you will notice and observe obvious, undeniable evidence of decay and a collapse in public safety, sanity, and of course, an escalation of the costs and the crime, all involved in living there. I mean, some cities are obviously worse than others. Detroit, Baltimore, Philadelphia, New York, and other similar East Coast cities seem absolutely determined to collapse themselves into these crimescapes and urban decay, almost reflexively as part of the left's collective incentive to consolidate political power. Of course, however, on the West Coast where I live, the Leftist Collective, almost in an effort to prove that they can destroy urban centers with even more drama and speed, they seem to be using San Francisco, Portland, Seattle, and Los Angeles as their proof of concept demonstrations of how they think the rest of us should live. Filthy cities filled with trash, zombie drug addicts living in tent garbage collectives, they kind of provide optimal ambiance, of course, for horrified visitors. Escalating and uncontrolled crime, bloated, incompetent bureaucracies, and then, of course, skyrocketing taxes. Those are then used to impose this collective political utopia that we're assured is just coming around the corner any minute. But all of these urban kind of utopian outcomes are just a feature. That's not a bug of this leftist kind of collective utopian dream. And this is particularly true if there was a political fight of some kind between factions and flavors of the left. Usually it's not Republicans, but once the craziest crew gets in charge, they want to lock down their political power and make it forever. So they must consolidate power, and chasing people out, basically the ones who don't profit from the grant grifting schemes or who don't enjoy the violent crime in that environment, well, this just makes your ability to keep the city under the power of the collective just that much easier. So inevitably and predictably, sane, productive people, they flee. They flee the collective utopia that they voted for. This is often the irony here, of course, that most of the worst political leaders who create these messes, they're originally voted into power. And sure, they probably lied to get to where they got. I mean, that's the nature of politics. And yes, people were probably foolish to believe them. And of course, corruption can buy a lot of votes and influence the outcome of an election, for sure. But regardless, these guys can't help themselves, and they promptly work very hard to destroy the place. Now, any place foolish enough to let them have access to political power and their ability to impose their will on the hapless suckers who still live there, those are the places that suffer the most. So, of course, people flee. And this is rational and logical behavior. Even Democrats don't enjoy being victims of crime every day. And some might actually care about their kids, so fleeing the collective utopia they voted to impose, that just makes sense. There is a reason Detroit is half the population that it was 50 years ago. And the left always promises something that they can never deliver on in the real world. Utopia, or even movement in that direction, it always gets worse. Destruction, decay, misery, and collapse is basically all they can deliver over time. And it's always predictable. And it just tends to help cement the power base for the corrupt political class in charge. Now, this has always been true from the earliest kind of collective experiments in revolutionary France, off with their heads, to the Marxist collective religion that's imposed in Russia and China, Vietnam, Cambodia, Cuba, Venezuela, Zimbabwe, and whenever the collectivist experiments imposed on the people. Misery and disaster, they tend to follow. It doesn't matter your culture or your wealth or the natural resources that you inherit. The leftist collective is always capable of trashing your future and suppressing freedom. They just can't help themselves. So people inevitably, they always flee. And this is very predictable. People have known this for years, but today there's an entire educational establishment that's dedicated to pretending that this time will be different, just like they promised last time would be different, and like they promised so many times before. So your kids don't really receive the lessons on the Soviet Union experiment and its failure, or the endless repetitive failures of the socialist utopian religion in every flavor and attempt in every time that it's imposed. Now, maybe they can fool or indoctrinate the next generation. I mean, these political grifters are counting on this, in fact. However, people still flee, and the left will eventually do its best to prevent the people from fleeing. These are the ones, this is kind of a struggle that they have right now. It's part of their challenge. So if the collective left truly believed that its collectivist political scheme was more than just a fantastic dream that only works in pampered kind of classrooms somewhere in the wine and cheese crowd parties maybe on the weekend, they would demonstrate their success for all the world to see, and they would let the contrasts with the society that the rest of us, who probably liberty-loving rubes and hicks that we are, that we want to see. And you know that the communities that believe in the rule of law, but radical ideas that we support, like merit-based education systems or real consequences for criminals who do bad things, and kind of a recognition that government grant grifting, central planning operations, those aren't really the path of success for any community. Imagine a good left-leaning utopia right next to this kind of conservatively organized community. What would happen? What would that look like? Well, it's an easy question to answer because we see it every day. People will flee the leftist collectivist urban experiment disaster every time. Every single time. They move, they flee, they escape, even if it is just next door, or even just out of the city, maybe just to the suburb, and maybe sometimes to a nearby city or state, because very few people are going to be going the other way. And oh, sure, sometimes you move to a city for a job, right? Or to be near family, or because you didn't realize how bad it really is. But the trend is always getting away from these places as quickly as you can. Now, urban leftist experiments today are doing a great job attracting maybe drug addicts and criminals, and certainly low-income illegal immigrants who presumably they escape from even worse. Although when I speak with them, they're often mystified at how the left seems incapable of cleaning up its own act in these cities. But as businesses and job creators are also fleeing the urban leftist failures, I just don't believe any of them are going to continue to self-immolate without consequences. And this is kind of our challenge in America today. In my state of Washington right now, those who support these leftist utopian schemes that always fail and they always bring human misery and waste with them, they can't leave the rest of us alone. We're not really allowed to truly escape. And there's really nowhere left to escape to. Sure, we can flee the city itself, and that's wise and probably a survival instinct that's hard to completely suppress. So these guys have to follow us instead, and they try to ruin every place to where we flee. They don't want us to be able to defend ourselves, so they take our firearms. They eagerly unleash the most violent criminal predators that they can find and even celebrate releasing them into our communities with zero concern for the victims that they create. Now, our utopian leftists do their best to destroy any remnants of our education system that may have survived their kind of educational experiments, and they're furious and angry when parents homeschool their children, or dare they put them in private schools. I mean, how dare they, right? They hate us living in rural environments, and despite anyone who can be pretty self-sufficient in our lifestyle, they ridicule us for wanting to live independent from the programs that they impose on us, and they spend most of their time trying to increase the cost of living. They want to extract the cash for themselves and invent new ways to abuse those who just basically want to be left alone. So here's a word to those fleeing the left. They won't leave you alone, ever. They can't help themselves because your very existence outside of their control has the risk of providing the very dangerous contrast with the utopian dreams that they've created, and the contrast makes these leftist utopian dreams appear to be the nightmares they really are. And of course, any alternative freedom-oriented lifestyles, that makes that contrast much more stark. There were many community and collectivist experiments in American history. And in fact, in many ways, the American colonies were opportunities for people to experiment, oftentimes with socialistic structures, sometimes in horrible and unsustainable ways. Now, usually freedom and liberty won, as utopian collective experiments typically failed on their own. People often fled their home countries to come to America in an effort to flee whatever failing political and economic experiments that they left behind. However, in the post-Marxian world that we see today, there is a more aggressive and sustained effort to snuff out alternative freedom-oriented options for living. Even in our nation, which prides itself on being the land of the free, we're witnessing our freedom and liberty under regular and sustained assault right now. So I really want to discuss this topic today because we don't have the luxury of fleeing any longer. There is no other nation or continent to where we can go and live in freedom or liberty, unmolested by the utopian leftist movement or whatever flavor of the day they want to call themselves. We can relocate from the urban decay and the collapsing cities, sure, but we can only go so far. Sometimes we just have to genuinely decide that we can't run any longer. Our running days are behind us. Now, this is an exciting time to be alive. But exciting doesn't necessarily translate into safe or predictable time to be alive. It's our time, and we have to recognize that the opportunities and dangers that surround us, that we do live in this very much a time of turmoil. I've got some suggestions, and I'm eager to hear your thoughts down in the comment section below and kind of get your comments on some of my thoughts here. But here's basically some of my suggestions. You are most able to be effective if you recognize that you're not alone with either your beliefs or your concerns. If you live rurally like I do, or if you live in a neighborhood or your small town, it's time for you to get to know your neighbors. Meet them in person, talk to them, get to know them now. Understand how you can help each other. Form a block watch group maybe, or just create a way of using Facebook or hopefully a different platform to stay in touch and compare notes on happenings where you live. A block watch is actually a great way to do this, but the methods and style of these kind of loose affiliations, they may change and they're going to vary by what interests you and your neighbors might have. If you have children, you need to be engaged and involved in their education. Don't outsource it to others. That doesn't mean that other people can't help. Good teachers and good instructors are valuable for learning, but you can't just expect that the children are going to learn everything they need to learn at school. A pro tip for you, school, even a good one, it just isn't going to do the job alone. And I suspect that if you're a parent or a grandparent, you can have a great influence with your kids or even kids in the neighborhood by teaching them skills or truths that they probably don't know. Every bit's going to help. Finally, find the closest leftist utopian failure near you. It's usually going to be a city. Help expose the truth about that place, far and wide. Do it right now. As many of our cities continue to kind of descend into failure, we have to recognize that opportunities will arise in the future eventually to reverse this decay, change the disaster, and eventually fix what's broken today. Nothing is static. This won't, of course, happen on its own, and it always takes a lot of work. But do it for yourself. Leftist failures are not frozen in time. They always spread, so it's in your best interest, it's actually all of our best interests, to arrest the decline or basically help after they kind of hit rock bottom. All leftist political experiments, they eventually fail, and they always produce great human misery in the process. However, rather than just let them jump back into a new disaster, we can really help them turn around, I believe. Now, one reason I'm doing this video is just to let you know that there's nobody coming to rescue you or me. Our government and the bureaucracy, which kind of thrives on it, that exists mostly to perpetuate itself, and they've created an unsustainable project in most cases. So inevitably, many institutions that exist today, they're inevitably going to fail. Don't expect anyone there to help us. They probably won't be able to do so even if they wanted to. So once you recognize this inevitability, then it helps to know that we're basically responsible for ourselves, our family, of course, and our neighbors, and really ultimately our community. I mean, these things can impact others, and I think that it's worth the effort to make this impact right now. And yes, I know this sounds like some type of motivational, uplifting speech, maybe not that motivational, but if any of us do this, then I think we're going to be able to fix a lot of things that are currently broken. And regardless of national challenges or political fiascos, we can help our local communities all the time. We can help them to become kind of this beacon of light to where people flee rather than flee from. Now, my lefty trolls, basically people who don't like me too much, they hate this concept, of course. They don't want us to be engaged. They want us to give up. They want you to give up. They don't want us to care about our communities or our families. And that's exactly why, in my opinion, we must do this. So, just in closing, get to know others in your community who share your values. Get to know them right now. Number 2, educate your children and or the children near you. You have more to teach than you realize, and I believe that there's a great hunger out there for more education. Finally, pick a local leftist utopian failure, usually it's a city. Start exposing the truth, providing suggestions, and finding ways to fix what is broken, even if for no other reason than to help create a plan for someone else in the near future. Because in the end, the future belongs to those who show up.